I have always looked at raising children as finding a way to minimize the stress between the child and I. On one hand, I can be permissive and let things be, let everything be free and treat my children as I would my neighbors or perhaps my friends, and allow their room to stay uncleaned, not monitor homework, not regulate their chores, be very lax on consequences. This in turn makes me stressed out, and things tend to compound the responsibilities, and the children's life tend to become more disorganized in terms of, why would they want to spend time in their dirty room? They can't possibly focus on doing homework in it, for example. On the other hand, I could rule with an iron fist of authoritarianism. As you perhaps have seen with the parenting scale, it's got three types of parenting: permissive on one side, authoritarianism on the other, and authoritative in the middle. And I think this is perhaps a good interpretation of it and what I'm going to show you at the chores table. But if I rule with this iron fist of authoritarianism and I let my emotions air out when something is performed incorrectly, and at least justify to myself that, well, I will never have to confront this issue again if I use enough, anger in it. But this in turn makes the kids stressed out, and they're not the battles that I like fighting if given a choice. It's not the hill I want to die on. And on this point, I think for both authoritarian parenting styles and perhaps the permissive parent that is blown up from neglected duty and stored anger, I have often found that lecturing during consequences only teaches resentment to the children. In other words, I think people's ears turn off most at these moments of conflict. Unless the child is young and needs to be educated on a responsibility, it is most often best to just show them how they do it, or perhaps how they did it incorrectly. Let it be a speech of educational show and tell instead of one in criticism. If the rules are in place, then their own consciousness will be there to remind them of the perhaps wrongdoing. So I'd file lecturing, especially under any sermons, soap boxes, guilt foo, etc. If there is a bigger problem, save the intervention for a moment of peace. Ultimately, one extreme or the other leads to greater stressors. Both parenting extremes typically result in long-term consequences for the child at hand. For both sides present an issue where the child has no idea of what the world expects for them. For example, with permissive parenting, they don't know what responsibilities the world expects of them because the parent perhaps didn't give them many of what they should do, and therefore when they go out in the world they're disorganized and don't even know how to fold their laundry perhaps. Whereas authoritarian parenting, where if you just throw the rules at them at the moment, they have no clue, or there's just such a huge array of what the rules are, and it's not very well established, then the kid just expects the world to jump down their throat, for perhaps any mistake, and they're not willing to experiment or be an entrepreneur, for example. But perhaps I had the wrong mindset. As a parent, you have to be strict, as in making clearly established rules and ready to enforce them so they can understand exactly what they are doing and when that doing goes wrong. And this guideline needs to act in a checks and balances of preventing yourself, the parent, from blowing up for poor logistical reasons and away from perhaps any form of a guideline. Like a manager's function at any job, they are the responsibility of whether the ship floats or sinks. The manager is the source of the responsibility. They are blamed for a mistake at perhaps any business. Even though your job is of forming your child into a functional adult, it is always worthwhile to see what you can change yourself before altering a child's pattern, because one of the most important parts of parenting is staying consistent with what chores, responsibilities, etc. you give them. Is that consistency. And again, in terms of efficiency, one thing too was that instead of me having to remind them every day of what was expected of them, especially as they got older, it was that there could be this sort of 10 commandments, these sort of systems here, like a chores table, for them to remind themselves. So it'd be sort of like a kid asking you what's for dinner every day, and perhaps every kid asks you every day, and that can certainly compound if you don't have a place to just show them or put where it's at. So anyways, I changed this mindset over time of minimizing stress for both of us to one of efficiency so that there would be less lecturing and reminders, etc. What works most permissively but serves as the teaching tool, authoritarian reminder when things do go awry from time to time. These two spreadsheets may appear a bit confusing. For me, the children already had chores, so filing in the list has always been natural to me. However, there's a few different ways of charting these responsibilities out. One, are you going to ask your children to do chores on the weekends or spread it out on the weekdays? Certainly, there's a benefit on the weekends when they don't have school, added that they can, sort of knock out their chores before doing anything else for the first hour or two, or, early in the weekend mornings. If they're wanting to go out or expecting to go somewhere, or perhaps even wanting to use electronics, you can just say, you're not going to be able to get on your computer until you finish your chores. So, are you going to just spread it out over the entire week, as a lighter load, or over, the weekdays or the weekends? Two, do you want your children to share the burden of responsibility or to distribute it based on age, ownership, etc.? For example, if the pet is technically one kid's, should they be the sole responsible for feeding, cleaning, and caring for it? This can certainly present issues with pets if one of the kids has an allergy to dander or something. But again, not all kids can, can carry the trash out. For example, not all of them are tall enough to reach the dishwasher or the sink to wash dishes. So I'll include something in the description that'll show you from WebMD sort of chores for children based on their age and what's recommended. And then three, do you want weekly required task lists and everyday responsibility list? This is what you can see on the second one here. You see that there's on the left here, there's a weekly tasks that's, something that'll be checked every Sunday night. And then an everyday type of task list. Although I'll warn you, especially for younger kids, just matching up the day-to-day responsibilities on the table may be easier for them, something like this. So that they'll just, they'll say, oh, I'm Bonnie, today's Monday, this are the things I do. Even though there might be something on here every day that's like unload dishwasher. So even though this one on the bottom looks cleaner, I do think I've had better success with just putting it by the day. The other one tends to get a little bit convoluted. So a couple of other things. One, you may want to take a moment to sort out what is more difficult for the appropriate ages. For example, like I said before, the children that might lack height to do dishes and might lack the attention to detail in washing them. I am generally of the opinion, though, that over the years, children should switch roles in order to harvest lessons from each of these responsibilities. A grown kid that does not take toll in doing dishes, for example, may not take care of their own as an adult, and certainly I'll include this perhaps doesn't fit with the chore table, but I'll have a list of other expected things like, taking your shoes off before you come in, so you don't get the floors dirty. Certainly, one thing I found is that if the kids will put their dishes after they've eaten in the dishwasher, they'll, after they've done the dishes, for everyone, they understand the totality of what it's like to feed, for the dishes for 5, 6, 7, plus people, and then they'll understand, oh well, I should put my own dishes away, so that that doesn't compound for the next person, or something like that. So again, I do recommend switching every few years, so that they've done a little bit of everything and understood the importance of them. It even comes back down to washing or, folding your clothes and washing them, because you might go to work with a suit that hasn't been ironed or wasn't folded well, perhaps, and you don't get the job because you don't look professional. Certainly these things make a big difference in the world in terms of presenting yourself. So again, below I will include a link from WebMD that has a basic chart for introducing jobs at certain ages, that are recommended. So, and again, I think on that note too, it's also really important that you introduce them to chores earlier, even if they're dead simple chores to do. So, just to get them on that responsibility, I think the older they get, and the later you introduce the some form of responsibility, the more of a difficult time you're going to have in introducing it to them. So, two, also always be receptive to the child's overall workload. This seems fairly obvious, but it's worth noting. Some schools give more homework than others, and cleaning a room daily may be too much, especially when said room is shared, if there's like 2 or 3 people in that room. I have edited the frequency and timing of chores in the past, and so be ready to edit the table. It is also worth noting that I've found spacing out room cleaning too much can make an easily digestible mess that might only take 5 or 10 minutes into an existential crisis requiring hours instead of minutes to tidy. So, on that note, edit what you find necessary. It is worth redoing the list, perhaps once a year, if not more frequently. Um, so, um, again, on that note, I think the biggest deal here with the cleaning room is if there's several people in that room, you do have an advantage because you can say, Edgar can clean the room Monday, Clementine can clean the room Tuesday, Barley can do the room Wednesday, and just keep rotating like that. And perhaps in that system, Sunday would be a day off. But, I don't think the clean up your individual mess works as well in regards to room cleaning because typically the kids will just say, this toy here doesn't belong to me, and they'll all claim the same thing, and then nobody will clean it up. Um, so, anyways, just a tidbit there. So just be receptive to the overall workload and be ready to change it. I'll include another note there on the bottom. Three, remember in the cases where they are not doing a job well, take the manager's role and teach whenever necessary. I usually divide the consequences between accomplishing the task at all versus how well they are doing it. The consequence of not doing a job well usually results in teaching initially and possibly after consistent failure, just redoing it entirely or more frequently. So, for example, if a kid's, forgotten to, or they're not doing a very good job vacuuming, you've reminded them that vacuuming usually takes 10-15 minutes and they're doing it in 5, that they'll end up spending more time when you keep telling them, oh, well, you know what, you need to vacuum again because you clearly didn't cover the kitchen or something like that. Or lack of attention to detail, especially when they get older. So, again, a consequence of not doing it well usually results in repeating the task. Whereas I think not accomplishing it all, and certainly not discussing it, will lead to another form of consequence, such as grounding. Again, I'll have another note on that below. So you may want to make a separate list or sort of a public knowledge of shared individual responsibilities. While one child may put all of the cooking dishes away after dinner, for example, like I said earlier, it is expected of everyone to rinse their own plate off and put it in the dishwasher. Taking shoes off before going to bed, or going inside, excuse me, cleaning up after yourself in the living room, etc. I think these result in a different sort of set of consequences as well after teaching and reinforcing. Generally, though, it is worth noting once one person, including parents, cease to consistently do sort of a shared personal responsibility, more will join in on the lazy response. Again, if even one parent isn't pushing their dish in the dishwasher, you'll have others that'll just stack it on top of theirs and hope that there's no evidence of that being followed. So people imitate one another, and children are extremely likely to do this as they are learning who they want to become. So again, it might be worth it to make just a separate list of shared individual responsibilities, and that can be reinforced by them watching you do it as well. Certainly if your room is messy and you don't put away your clothes, how could your kids be expected to do the same? So, 5, I typically sort or acknowledge chores into two fields. A, is this chore cleaning up after themselves? So, anything to do inside their room, sort of personal laundry or cleaning their room, basically is this their own chore that takes care of themselves, and or B, is this a chore helping the family or household? Anything to do outside their room, basically. Dishes, trash, cleaning out the outside their room, feeding their pet, sort of vacuuming, anything that helps the household as opposed to basically just themselves. Whatever you end up choosing, though, as a consequence or reward, and the first case of negotiating exceptions that I'm going to include below, I would include on the bottom of the chore list that you print, so that they might know what the consequences and the exceptions are. And I'll go more into this in a minute. Um, I'll go more into what I think sort of consequences should be at a later date in regards to what action perhaps has happened. But it is important that they know the consequences of their actions. Um, sort of, so I have this in the two fields as well. Sort of one, there's privileges revoked, making an announcement with them on losing electronics the following day in case of failure to complete without an exception. So, I think the biggest one for me here is, since most kids seem to not want to go outside, and getting grounded outside is a bigger consequence now, or less of a consequence now. I think that, well, actually, wow, I'm really confusing my words. So basically, one of my points is that since kids seem to go outside less these days and more interested in electronics, I think I think perhaps the privilege revoked that I'll use most often is losing of electronics, losing of phone, of computer, of television, of video games, etc. Um, so if they fail to complete a task, I'll revoke the privilege. Um, you know, I just again do it whatever you think is necessary for your kid. My own point was just the fact that grounding a kid outside seems like a bigger consequence now than grounding them inside was 20 years ago. So, two is allowance. If you can afford it, that is. I don't think this option works well with younger children, particularly. In this case, though, of incentivizing them, it is best to pay for their respective performance. So, not whether they did the job, but how well they did it. In other words, they shouldn't expect the totality of the allowance for simply completing it. Be sure to show them how they can improve, especially when you can see it in the action rather than shaming them on payday, for example. Again, this goes back to the guilt foo, the sermon, the soapbox type thing. Um, this will certainly, get it so that instead of just saying, well, I did the job, I checked it off, that instead they'll focus on performing better in what they're doing because they'll have an incentive behind it. So certainly I think the allowance helps in how they do it rather than did they do it. So again, I have an exceptions list. I've mentioned this several times. This certainly might seem inflexible, but that's why I do make exceptions. The punishment for failure to do chores serves as a reminder to do them. Ideally, I want my children to suffer the consequences as little as possible and keep the consequences within clearly defined rules that they can know and remember. And I think another point, too, if you make a chore table, is to make every chore here as simple as possible. The detail has to be in you teaching it to them. Again, it just makes it a little bit cluttered and confused between the two. Um, so, if the kid is failing to accomplish the task frequently, there may be a bigger problem that needs to be reviewed with them. So, again, I don't want the kids to have the consequence. But I will say taking away the privilege works, and I certainly want to do that as little as possible, but at the same time get the point across. And that's where I think, certainly more of the lecturing parenting styles isn't going to teach, the lesson very well in the end. So, the whole point behind doing this is that, well, perhaps if there's one day of a privilege being revoked, that the next times they'll stay more consistent. So, One, as long as you talk to the parent before the day ends, I will 95% of the time be willing to renegotiate them completing the task at a later date, and then I will hold them to that. So let's say it's pretty much their bedtime. I mean, I don't even mind if it's right before bed. They said, oh, hey, I wasn't able to clean the room, again, so I don't have to lecture them and remind them. But they tell me that they weren't able to do it, and they said, well, I'll do it tomorrow. Or if tomorrow has a party that they're going to, then perhaps the next day. On one hand, you can easily see where a responsibility is going to tumble, and then it's been like 2 weeks, and X hasn't been done. But that's why the communication here is really important, especially if they come to me with the communication, and then say, I wasn't able to do this, but I'll redo it at this other time. The only time I'll probably say no and give the consequences is again if it's been several weeks, and at that point I've been reminding them that they need to do it and they're still not doing it. So too, delays, sort of sickness, long day at school, staying at a friend's house, especially with the long days at school. If there's like an after school club, homework club, sports, and that might be worth reorganizing the chart, and giving them less responsibility on those days. When time and energy is constrained, I usually prioritize the family helping chores as more important, since the household flow can get backed up when the kitchen is rampant with dishes, the trash cans are overflowed, or the pets are starving. So, if they only have 10, 20 minutes to do a chore, let's say I'm going to prioritize the family chores over their personal chores. The room can always be done at a later date, but perhaps the pets always can't be fed. So, and then three, grades and consistency. How long does it happen? If grades are good, I am much more willing to make exceptions, especially again for their own chores, over household chores. It is typically my philosophy that children doing well behaviorally with chores and with school need less parenting. So basically, is if their behavior is good, if they're doing their chores or reasonably well, and they're doing well with school, especially with like 2 out of 3 of those, then I've done my job well. They need less parenting. Whereas kids doing poorly with usually 2 or 3 of these will require more help. And it is definitely how you help that will make the difference between authoritarian and authoritative parenting, if you're actually making a committed effort to teach them. So just a couple notes on the creating a chore table. If I haven't filled your head with philosophy, is I just use Google Docs, because if you have a Gmail account, you can use the Google Drive. I think it gives you like 15 gigabytes of cloud data, so you can easily make one of these documents. It's what most of the schools use anyways. But if you just open up a new Google document, if you go to File, Page Setup, and you change it from portrait to landscape, usually your printer is going to print letter anyways. Hit OK, and it'll make it that wider format, like what I used here. And then you'll just insert, and then hit Table. So again, and like you always have to add more. So like let's say if I'm going to do it every day of the week, I'm not going to use 7. I'm going to have to use 8. I believe that's rows, just because I have to have that extra slot for the name, and then you'll have to do the same thing down. So let's say if I have 2 kids, then I'll need 3 columns. 3 columns, because actually I think that's rows. Oh well, anyways, so just make sure you add another, because you'll need the top row for the days of the week. So there you go, and it'll fill up after each time you make it longer. So that's again how I do it. And again, I would put below what are the exceptions. Make sure you always talk to me if you can't complete a task, for example. Again, like I said before, I'll separate punishments by sort of like I think behavioral consequences, like if they're dropping curse words or back talk or something like that, deserve a separate form of consequences versus failure to complete a chore. And that might also be worth mentioning down below here as well. Again, keep it short, keep it sweet, and keep it easy to understand, or else it won't be used at all. It'll be over cluttered and jumbled. And that's why I typically don't recommend the weekly tasks and the everyday chores, even though it looks very clean and professional. Less words is better. Fill in the boxes. Just see what works. Especially if the kids are young and you're just trying to give them something to perhaps understand what responsibility is, even if it's literally put your dirty clothes away. I've found that if you're willing to work with kids, that they're a lot more reasonable, whereas if you're being irrational with them, they're probably going to react in a similar manner in terms of imitation. So I think, again, especially if you do it at a younger age, I think they'll be more willing to understand and want to go through with a system like this. And by the gods, it will save you from having to repeat things 10,000 times. Again, just work with them, be willing to edit it, and be willing to negotiate. And hopefully this helps someone out there, and hopefully it makes sense. So cheers and good luck.